Hello, everyone. It's the one, the only, it's V, the gorilla, coming to you live. CJ can't be with us today because he had some things to do around the house and some things have come up. But with that being said, guys, we have none other than the man, the myth, the legend. Um, oh, hold on one second, Paul. I just want to verify something here real quick. I think our hangout. Okay, good. We are live. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. Usually CJ handles all this stuff, so. So I'm kind of lost without him. But anyway, so it's one and only London Paul. He's here with us. There's so many things going on, Paul. Paul, where do we begin? I mean, this weekend was the farthest thing from quiet.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and whatever to everyone, and to UV as well, of course. Well, yeah, where do we start? I think we need about 20 hours to talk about what's going on, never mind one. But I think we can start with the attempts to take Trump down. I mean, there's some very overt things, but there's a covert plan that's coming out from the Democrats where they've got this multi-pronged attack that they want to take him down, and they're going to use a media vehicle that wants to pick up on any slight perceived mistakes that Trump makes. So, and they want to infer that therefore you have a president that can't be trusted because he got this point wrong or that point wrong.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, the Democrats have collected literally thousands of hours of videos showing Trump over the years, and they've many more thousands of hours of other videos of members of his cabinet. And they've got this, apparently, this sophisticated technology, which was designed for the Department of Defense. Not sure quite how they got their hands on it, but what they're looking to do is find contradictions between statements, they may have made 10 years ago and their current positions on everything they've ever said. And there are plans to extend this to many more of the president's new collaborators within the administration.
Jeez.
I mean, just in that basis, I mean, quite what Donald Trump may have said 10 years ago has got to do with today. But I think it's all part of this idea of trying to convince the electorate they made a mistake and they shouldn't be voting for him. And I guess with some view to trying to take control in the midterms, etc. But they're also formed this firm of lawyers who are tasked with tracking anything that they could create a scandal in the Trump administration.
Mm.
And they're looking obviously for impeachment opportunities, filing lawsuits, and combating what they term government misinformation, which obviously is the exact opposite, and most of the time, of course. And they want to create also something like a digital platform, not exactly sure what that is, but they're going to spread these constant kind of themes or memes about Trump. So like Trump's authoritarian, he's controlled by Putin, he's weak and quick-tempered personality, and he was not elected by the majority of US citizens. And this, therefore, kind of in their eyes, illegitimate. Well, we kind of just question still quite who rigged what election. How many votes did Clinton get that Clinton shouldn't have got? I mean, there's some disparity, certainly, within the voting from that perspective. Also, this idea that, Trump's this billionaire, so he's got these conflicts of interest between, his personal affairs and that of the state. Well, actually, the irony is, of course, that Trump being a billionaire means he's immune to being blackmailed, unlike other presidents in the past. And of course, they want to perceive this idea that he's a threat to minorities and he's against, he's just all for white people and against everybody else. And they want to give this idea that this anti-Trump opposition is growing throughout the country. And, and then we've got to save democracy and support all these, the Democrats who are attacking Trump and take down those who are cooperating with Trump. But this is a really coordinated action. It's not, I mean, it doesn't concern me because I don't think ultimately they'll succeed in what they're trying to do, because I actually think the more they try to do this, the more they're going to destroy their own credibility. And we can kind of come on to the wiretap thing in a minute. So whilst it seems quite frightening from one perspective, in reality it isn't, but it shows the concerted effort that they want to employ in trying to take Trump down. And of course, I still get people going, but he's cabal, he's part of the, it's just a game. I mean, do you really think they go to these lengths if that was the case? I mean, it's absolute nonsense.
No, absolutely correct, man. And it's funny to me that, their whole thing is, oh, we need to save democracy. And how do we do it? How do we save democracy? Well, we got to throw it to Hillary Clinton. That's how we save democracy.
Well, yes. Well, yeah, and that's the farcical nature. But of course, they're trying to appeal to people who don't understand the reality of what's going on. But of course, there's this timeline where they're trying to force this point. Meanwhile, Trump does what Trump does. And at some point, there's going to be this realization, and forget whether you're a Republican, Democrat, just anybody's going to start to go, hang on a minute, this just doesn't stack up anymore. Now, of course, we can move on to the whole wiretap thing with Trump, and obviously came out with a statement about Obama. Now, of course, presidents have the power to declassify anything at any time. So Trump could, if you want to do, immediately make public any government records of such surveillance. Now, of course, Obama's spokesman responded to Trump's tweet by saying, neither the President Obama nor any White House official ever ordered surveillance on any US citizen. Notably, of course, but of course, the great statement is they didn't deny that someone. Well, what they said is this statement doesn't deny that someone in the Obama administration ordered surveillance on Trump Tower, simply that the White House did not. I mean, how big and far and wide, as we all know, is the Obama administration? Now, of course, Trump has the power to clarify it and everything else about the Russia story simply by declassifying surveillance records of contacts between people or alleged contacts between people in his administration and Russia, although, of course, there has been contacts. Now, what we understand is that it's been confirmed that the White House counsel is now searching for these FISA. Now, I know you mentioned it earlier, but if anyone doesn't know, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, or series of warrants, allegedly issued in an Obama-era investigation of Trump's ties to Russia. Now, of course, the office wants to access any order issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court relating to Trump, his campaign, or any of his immediate associates. Now, typically, from what I understand, these documents are only usually available to law enforcement. And whilst the White House obviously has the authority to request the documents, they typically don't, largely because the DOJ is supposed to be insulated from political pressure to take on or complete investigations. Well, I question that as well, that largely because the Department of Justice is supposed to be insulated. Well, how much is that reality in previous administrations? But anyway, we can park that for now. But of course, it's alleged that the DOJ began an investigation into a Russian bank in 2016, looking for money flowing between that bank, obviously, and presidential campaigns. Now, it's alleged, apparently, that the FBI approached the FISA court for permission to investigate a server. Apparently that warrant was turned down, but another more specific one was not. But after that, the whole story gets very murky. I mean, did the FBI find anything? Is it still investigating things? Or could it have requested other FISA warrants with more specific details about Trump's electoral inner circle? Now, clearly, if the White House retrieves these alleged FISA documents, Trump will have the executive option to declassify whatever information remains about the warrants and the ensuing investigation. Right. Now, people immediately go, well, and let's, in the balance of fairness, say, okay, it's a double-edged sword. If Trump declassifies the information, it could certainly reveal that Obama had ordered a large-scale investigation into his contacts with the Russians. And also, equally on the flip side, it could reveal that Trump's inner circle did, in fact, have contact with the Russians. Now, the logic of this is, why would Trump go to these measures to try and retrieve these documents if, in fact, it was the latter? You just can't see any rationale behind doing it. But by all accounts, at this stage, the White House counsel, obviously on the administration's order, is just trying to explore how to obtain these possible FISA warrants. They're certainly going through that process, and it suggests to me they believe they have, sufficient reason to take these allegations against Obama seriously. And I don't think they would push this button and then say, well, we've obtained the warrants, but we're not going to tell you what happened.
Right, exactly.
Because, of course, the immediate question would be, well, why aren't you? I mean, and yes, of course, we're going to hear all manner of people saying that Trump's guilty of this and Trump's guilty of that. But it's just absolutely farcical, because they once, as ever happens, they never produce evidence. But it's part of the way of controlling the thought process in right. The American people and beyond, that we say something, therefore it's true, without producing a single shred of evidence to support that view.
Correct. Absolutely correct, man. The craziest thing is that there's going to be a paper trail here. I don't see, and I think this is what's very important here. Trump needs to push this very hard, very quickly. I think he will. Paul, what do you think? Do you feel that there is a chance here that we could finally see some individuals going to jail?
I think absolutely it will happen. Whether it happens quickly,
Mhm.
is another matter. But I think what we need to do in order to take kind of stock in this situation is, okay, all of us want an end to this insanity, and we all have our views more or less as to who's involved and who might be or might not be, etc. But the most important thing is when whoever they go after, they make sure they have a watertight case, that they don't allow someone to wriggle out of it on some legal technicality or some potential lack of evidence that doesn't stack up with the charges. They've got to make sure it's completely watertight. So whoever they do look to take down, and it might be more than one person, it could be 3, 4, 10 simultaneously. I know there's this talk of mass arrest. I'm more in favour it's going to be on a kind of piecemeal basis. I don't think we're going to see mass arrests like people assume. But does Trump want to? Well, of course, Trump wants to see this happen as soon as possible, because what will it do? It will damage the credibility of the people trying to take him down, and it will give him a huge boost in terms of, and I'm not saying opinion polls or everything, but he needs to get all the American people on side to realize what he's actually doing and who is the real opposition in their country, which has been, of course, the case in Europe and the UK and everywhere else in the Western world for that matter. So yeah, I think there's an imperative to do this as soon as possible, but they need to make sure they do it in a way that it sticks, because of course the credibility damage is if you say, okay, well, we're going to charge person X with offences 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then very quickly it gets thrown out of court or it's just demolished. Okay, the credibility damage to Trump would be huge, and of course to the person who's not guilty, who's then subsequently in the eyes of the people isn't guilty of anything, and particularly if it's someone who's an arch adversary of his, it will give them a huge credibility boost. So it's a double whammy against Trump in that regard. So I think you have
Yeah.
to be extremely careful. And yes, we are all impatient to see things happen, but we have to temper that in making sure that whatever's done is done in the correct procedures. So, and also we have to also be fair to whoever it is and say that due process is done and people see that legal process is done correctly. And if someone's found guilty, then yeah, they're found guilty, and whatever they're found guilty of, they're sentenced accordingly, whatever that might be. It's important in the new paradigm, so to speak, that everything seems to be done fairly, and Trump has to do that, because there's no good saying to the world, well, I've got a new vision for America, and then we start running roughshod and doing the kind of things that previous administrations have done, which has damaged the US's credibility abroad as well as within their own country. So I think they have to be careful about that.
Oh yeah, 1000%. I think it's vital that there is an arrest that is done, because I believe wholeheartedly, Paul, that would be a morale boost for the vast majority of this country. It would also be a just like you said, it would be a delegitimizing blow to any sort of an opposition to what is occurring, especially with this nationalistic movements, man. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it is. Look, it is frustrating. I mean, as much as I can be very calm and collected talking about things, there is a frustration because we want an end to this madness. And when and I don't care where it starts in the world. If it starts in the US, great. If it starts in the UK, great. But we just need that domino effect that gets the process moving, and people start to go. Well, the people who don't understand, it's great for all of us who do understand what's going on, to varying degrees. But we want to start to wake up the people who know nothing, who'll start to question, hang on, what is going on here? Why is this person being charged? And starts to follow. And they will, of course, they'll follow with interest as to what the case is, what's going on. And when more and more information comes out, it's a kind of bridge building process to get more and more people to understand, because that's the important thing here.
Yeah.
Eventually, you reach a critical tipping point in any nation where enough people understand what's going on and say enough's enough. Now, of course, the great thing is having Trump in power, whatever people may think about him, however they like him, dislike him, he does have the US best interests at heart. He may make mistakes, and that is entirely possible, but he will do things to the best of his ability. And the one thing he is mindful of, if people have ideas, he listens to them. He has teams of people around him who he trusts implicitly. And if they say to him, Donald, I think this is a very bad mistake, for example, whatever policy it might be, he will take stock of it and take it on board and then say, okay, well, actually, I agree with you, I won't do that. He may disagree, but then he'll stand by his decision and say, well, I made the decision. And if it blows up in my face, I have to take the consequences. Well, that's fair enough. But I think
Yeah.
that's an important distinction where he is prepared to make those decisions. And yes, he undoubtedly he will make mistakes because every person on this planet makes mistakes, despite what many like to think to the contrary. So particularly in the political circle. So yeah, but it's an important point we need to mention with regards to him.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. Yeah, it has to be done uh, as cleanly as possible. I totally get that. What else is going on, man? What else do you see happening? Within the globe, not only with here in the United States, but how do you think the rest of the world is taking this whole, wiretapping thing? I think, there's some shock here. I mean, were it not that Merkel's phone was tapped by the Obama administration? I mean, come on.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we know from history with what's gone on with the NSA and their involvement in wiretapping. I mean, the reality is everybody knows that this goes on. I mean, every country listens to everybody else. I mean, not necessarily every, but the major countries. Yeah, Russia's undoubtedly listened to the US and vice versa. I think though when it starts to become a situation where someone's going, well, hang on, allegations are made against the former president of the US, and a lot of people still think he's the greatest president the US has ever had. And
Oh, Jesus, I know, right? It's unbelievable.
I mean, so it's going to take time for reality to sink in, but all these kind of things, eventually it'll coalesce into something that has substance and meaning. Yeah, I think people are increasingly becoming more and more surprised on a daily basis as to the reality of what's going on. And Trump's doing a great job in terms of the US. Yes, slowly people are seeing realities coming to the fore in across Europe, hence why we had the Brexit vote, why increasingly there's more and more consternation in Holland. I think something like 60% of the people want out of the European Union now. It's never been that high, and that's kind of in a post-Brexit world. Wilders might well get the majority of seats, unlike he might be the biggest party, but it's going to be a big, huge hammer blow to Dutch politics as it is now. And of course, Germany's the same. But ultimately, I mean, you can talk about Germany in a minute because there's a lot of things going on there. But what's going to happen in Europe, and maybe we can just briefly move on to Europe with regards to Germany. Well, first of all, let's talk about Deutsche Bank, because
Mhm.
Deutsche Bank's is like a cat with a million lives. I mean, it's been bailed out again. They raised 8 billion in a new capital rights offering, a 40% discount to the share price, but they've raised 8 billion. They're recapitalized, and I remember last year everyone was going, "Oh, Deutsche Bank's going to hit the rails. It's going to hit the buffers. It's finished." But you could see there was a concerted effort amongst the capitalists to take Deutsche Bank down, and all the while someone kept propping them up and stopping it happening. Now, from my perspective, I think the Chinese are behind why they don't want Deutsche Bank to go down. It doesn't mean Deutsche Bank won't ultimately go down, but I think they would see Deutsche Bank in the new paradigm as a great conduit for them in Europe, Germany at the heart of it. And that's why I think every effort's been done to stop Deutsche Bank going down, because every concerted effort has been made to marginalize the bank, try them for every crime they can find to really just effectively bankrupt them just in fines. And of course, every time that seems to be on the cards, they pull another rabbit out of the hat. And of course, they've raised 8 billion, and of course that shores up the business for the time being. And obviously, they're going through major operational and balance sheet restructuring. I think legitimately so, because BaFin, the German regulators, have been crawling all over them for a number of years. So, ironically, as much as they're in a very bad position, they've probably had more auditing done than any other bank on the planet put together.
Yeah.
So they survived to fight another day. But in terms of Germany, Merkel now's in an horrendously difficult position. I mean, she's
Mm.
under relentless pressure. And one of the major problems that's not coming out is just how many bankruptcies in Germany are occurring in their so-called Mittelstand, which is the backbone of German industry.
Hmm.
And of course, who's buying up all these high-tech companies in this? The Chinese.
Right.
And what they're doing is they're buying up all the companies and all the people to ensure a kind of smooth transfer of ownership. Now, obviously, there's the German elections coming up, and it's more this kind of Trump Schultz kind of fiasco that really doesn't matter. But I think the German elections are becoming less and less relevant. What I've understood, I've talked about this, not obviously with yourselves, but with other people in the past, that the traditional roots of nations are going to re-emerge, which is going to cause this huge wave of upheaval in the process. Now, if we look at Europe, and I always go back in history because world wars don't happen for the reasons we're told. And if you look at any map of Europe pre-World War One and look at the map of Europe today, well,
Yeah.
the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. Germany was half the size it is now when it was Prussia, and therefore Poland came into existence. But if you look at France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and nations like that, with all the monarchies, and Belgium and Holland,
Hmm.
they're all the same as they are today. Switzerland's the same. Now, from what I understand, and we'll see in the fullness of time, I'm not necessarily saying the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it is, was then pre-World War One, will come back as it is then, but we'll start to see nations form. So obviously Austria and Hungary were part of that. You also had Slovakia, parts of Romania. And these kind of nations are going to start to form unions within the European Union. And we're starting to see where there's groups of nations, which we, for example, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia are called on the European Council to take a lead role in EU decision making rather than the European Commission. So we're starting to see elements of that. We're seeing groups of nations in the European Union saying, we've had enough. We've got to end these sanctions against Russia. It's destroying us and doing nothing to the Russians. We've had Luxembourg's foreign minister saying, I don't really think Poland should be part of the EU anymore. There's this kind of ridiculous infighting. And then, of course, we saw the crazy decision by the EU lawmakers who said, we're going to deny US citizens visa-free travel.
Right.
Which is the most dumbest thing you could ever do, given the European Union is desperate to have Americans traveling to spend their dollars because it stimulates the European economy, and it has done for ever since the inception of the European Union and before that. I mean, I can remember traveling across Europe, and wherever you went, there was a lot of Americans there, of course, because they go on holiday and they spend their money. Now, by doing this, that's going to deter people traveling. But it's what's happening now is you're kind of seeing these cabalist, deep state factions, whatever you want to call them,
Right.
almost attacking each other in this pathetic way where they're just gnawing at each other's bones, destroying each other in the process, and
Hmm.
not realizing that what they're doing is actually of no benefit to them, but is doing everything to undermine the essence of what they're trying to achieve. And there's another example. It's complete insanity.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got France and Germany are very nervous now because obviously Germany's on the hook for 90% of France's debt. France has got huge problems. And they're both saying, well, do you know what? We're going to have to concede that the European Union, so we're going to have this varying speeds of integration, which of course is not going to work either. But it's a further sign of these growing divisions that exist within the European bloc. Now, logically, of course, the question always remains, well, if the European Union breaks up, what happens? Do
Hmm.
these nations just become nations again as sovereign? Yes, I mean, of course, I think, but from what I understand, as I say, you're going to start to see the rebirth of these. And people say, oh my God, it sounds like an empire. This is not what we want. But these are old historical lands that never had problems. Yeah,
Right.
I'm not saying they were perfect, but I think we'll start to see the rebirth of those kind of groups of nations. Now, it might not be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but you may see, for example, Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic,
Hmm.
Slovakia, Slovenia, and nations like that, all forming some sort of union. Now, they may have a currency, for example,
Yeah.
and
They're
they may
both.
do trade together. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
in
And
other words, Paul, these countries are going to go back to their natural spheres of influence.
yeah, and of course, why the whole purpose of the World Wars? Yeah, I mean, World War One, the ultimate aim was to destroy the Tsars. Why? Because they wanted to weaken Russia, and of course, but the reality is they wanted to tear apart the existing empires, for want of a better word, that existed in Europe. I mean, you look at the geographical map of large parts of Europe, and it bears no resemblance to what it does today. And of course, what subsequently happened once the Iron Curtain came down and the Russian Empire collapsed, then of course all the old Soviet republics became independent. So you look at the map. I mean, I can remember as a child going, "Wow, I've never seen a map change so much from the kind of pre-World War One area." And I thought you'll never see it again, of course. And what we've seen in the last 30 years is a huge change of the geographical map of Europe.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we are. We're going to move back to that natural affinity where groups of nations work together. I mean, people talk about Russia and China and obviously things like Persia as though, well, this is just a reigniting these old alliances. These old alliances existed for hundreds of years before that, and they're just now reigniting. I think we're going to see these huge changes in Europe. I mean, there's arguments, and here's a bit of a contentious question. Perspective. And I mentioned it before, but from what I understand, Alaska is very much on the cards. The Russians are just doing what the Russians do and playing a very low key kind of idea as to what's going to happen in future. But by all accounts, at some point, the question, well, we only leased Alaska to you and we want it back, is going to happen. Then there's also the question with regards to the idea, and maybe someone can correct me or not, that obviously, for example, Texas and California at one time belonged to Mexico.
Yeah, yeah. Mexico held it for 13
Mm.
years. Prior to that, it was a couple hundred years under Spain.
So what's going to happen with respect to that? And of course, it was said to me some time ago that eventually the US may end up being split up into kind of territories which existed during, obviously, the native Indian times. Is that a possibility? Maybe, I don't know. But
Yeah,
I think what we're going to see is the reordering of the world into areas where nations just naturally formed alliances, got on well together. And the worst thing, of course, the cabal did was to take all these alliances and break them up and try to divide nation against nation. And of course, ultimately, people will say, well, they formed this huge European Union. Yeah, but of course they did. But in the process, they destroyed all the ability for lawmakers to make laws in their own country, destroy sovereignty, control nation. Those old empires weren't about that, but they work, and certain nations just fit together well. Russia and
yeah,
Germany do, for example. Yeah, and Russia and China are developing really strong relations. And of course, they're trying to bring other nations into the sphere. And you look at what's happening in the Middle East, and of course, Russia's very much this glue that's bringing all these nations. And as we said before, I mean, Syria is an obvious example, but they're now starting to bring other nations in with Iran into military cooperation, which is the former Soviet republic. So they're trying to not redraw the map, but trying to bring old alliances together with nations who ideologically fit together and they can work together. And that's a far more sensible way than forcing a group of nations in Europe together that really had no common interest to work
exactly.
with each other. And I think
Exactly.
that's an important distinction as to what's coming. I mean, time will tell, but I think we're already starting to see groups of nations in Europe that are kind of functioning that way, but not in an obvious way. But certainly, there's a lot of discussion going on which suggests that we're
Mhm.
starting to see evidence that that's going to come to pass again.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think also what we're seeing is the natural realignment. Like for instance, I mean, look at Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine's natural alignment has always been and always will be Russia.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain things that just happen, and historically, smaller nations always tend to become satellites of 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 whatever influence. And what I mean by whatever influence being like, whatever gradation of influence that a larger power that they're close to would always have within the area. It and that larger power not only becomes an influence on them, but also becomes their largest trading partner. You could see this everywhere in the world you look. I mean, look at China. Look at all the countries that are surrounding China that are heavily involved in trade in Asia with the Chinese, and you see this with the Russians and the Eastern Bloc. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the
Oh,
natural course
absolutely.
of events. I mean, for these globalists in their hubris to all of a sudden draw up Sykes-Picot like modern lines with trade agreements, with all of a sudden currency unions out of nowhere. It shows the hubris and the ridiculousness and the very poor planning and foresight that these people have in every single one of their calculations, Paul. It always seems to me they always underestimate. This is their biggest flaw. They always underestimate the power of human culture. They really,
Oh, most definitely. Yeah,
Yeah,
they've hugely underestimated that particular, and that's why, people for years said to me, "Oh, Russia's controlled by the cabal and China's controlled by the cabal." But if you understand the culture and the history of these nations, yeah, they did have huge influence in their nations, but they've spent the last decade or more, in the case of Russia, rooting all these NGOs out and oligarchs and kicking them out of the country because they don't want that controlling influence. And you
right.
mentioned Ukraine, and Ukraine's getting more and more interesting because Poroshenko was supposed to meet Trump, and the face-to-face meeting never materialized. Apparently, they've been holding telephone talks. The details remain undisclosed, but by all accounts, Kiev's now feeling the cold shoulder of Washington via Trump.
Yeah,
And of course, what was Ukraine and Kiev trying to do? They're trying to blockade and starve the Donetsk Republic people out. They've pushed back. They put their own economic blockade on parts of Ukraine. And it's now having a serious damaging effect on the Ukraine economy, which is teetering as it is. I
yeah,
mean, and then of course you've got the U.S. State Department who's now going, hang on a minute, we're going to start pointing out that Kiev's failures to investigate the obvious security force insanity that went on during the Maidan turmoil, and
mhm,
also what went on in other cities at the time. So they're getting a lot of pressure from the US. By all accounts, the US is going to cut its military aid, slash it this year with respect to Ukraine, and also going to want demands as to what the money is actually being spent on. And so what we're now seeing is we're going full circle where the cabal's idea of using Ukraine to start a world war, and that's ultimately what they wanted to do, and it failed. They then thought, well, we'll create economic sanctions, that'll destroy Russia. It failed. And now Ukraine is flat on its back in huge trouble. And you know, the problem is Ukraine as a nation is destroyed forever. You can really find it hard to see that the Donbass republics are ever going to be they're going to want to cede from uh, Ukraine. Now, will they have formed their own republics? Very likely. Will they be reabsorbed back into Russia? It's a possibility.
yeah,
But Kiev has backed itself into the corner where you're going to have probably three or four nations or coming out of what is now Ukraine. They've broken the country in so many ways, and we'll see that in the fullness of time. But the biggest problem you're going to have is, well, if you get rid of Poroshenko, and I think he's on borrowed time, it's only a matter of time before he ends up being overthrown himself. The problem is who the hell takes over and what are the ramifications, and that is a serious problem that I think Trump's aware of, certainly Putin's aware of, and they need to address this because it's all well and good saying, well, let's get rid of Poroshenko, but sometimes it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And if they can keep him around long enough to try and influence some change in the country, all well and good, but as a nation, it's being destroyed. And is that ever going to be repairable? It's probably unlikely, and it's better to allow the various republics to break away. And yeah, Ukraine will probably really just focus on Kiev and be a relatively small area. But that's what happens when the cabal get involved. And of course, now the people in Ukraine, after all the Maidan euphoria, because they thought, oh, we're going to be a free democracy, have learned the very painful lesson. What happens when the cabal takes over? They wreck your country, steal
yep,
all your assets, and every person in that nation's expendable.
yeah,
They don't care. As far as they're concerned, if a city is shelled and every civilian dies and it aids their cause, fine. That is all they're interested in. But the Ukrainian people are beginning to realize that. And whilst they may have some issues to do with what Donbass is doing, they increasingly realize why they're doing it. And they're starting to, whilst not being sympathetic, understand. And this is causing a huge amount of damage because, as well, what was Kiev doing? They were, rather than putting their troops on the front line, they were sending mercenaries on the front line, making sure that, sounding too crude, that they were the cannon fodder, quite happily for them all to die, whilst the
yeah,
Kiev actual military survived and were left unscathed. And of
mhm,
course, words got spread throughout the whole of Ukraine that this is going on. So they are fighting a losing battle. But yes, historically, of course, Ukraine has a natural affinity to move towards Russia now. Of course, the problem is people are being brainwashed with the idea that Russia's the big bad enemy and the European Union's their saviors. And if you join the European Union, everything's going to be fine. Well, just look at what the European Union's done to every country with a similar sized economy. It's
right,
wrecked them all. Just ask Greece. There's a great example of what they've done to one nation in particular. And it's not unique, of course, that countless other nations of small economies have been wrecked and destroyed by the European Union.
Absolutely correct, man. It always fascinates me to think that this whole Maidan thing was originally run by the U.S. State Department working with George Soros NGOs. And what they were able to do was get these malcontents together, and especially the young people there, and made the attraction of being a member of the EU so much more cool and hip and trendy than it is to actually stay with a set with the just being a satellite of the larger regional power, which had been Russia. And if you look at how abysmal that has turned out, you look at the fact that those countries that are staying in the Eastern Bloc that are having wonderful relations with Russia, that are integrating with the Eurasian Economic Union, as well as the New Silk Road, they're doing great. And you look at Ukraine, and all you have, and just like you said, wherever the cabal goes is death and destruction. They have nothing. They're officially a failed state in my book. Their
Oh,
resources are
absolutely,
gone.
completely.
Yeah, completely, Paul. And it's like Yemen. Here comes Yemen, and while they're fighting a civil war, what happened? Well, 60% of Yemen's oil are taken by countries and corporations that are run by the cabal. It's unreal, and there's nothing there for the people. Yep.
Well, yeah, and that's why Syria was the sort of buck the trend, because it was the same idea. You're not playing ball with us, so we'll steal all your assets. Of course, we fast forward in history, we've had, and it's not a civil war, it's a war to remove Assad and kill anyone in the process. Now, we've reached the stage where largely ISIS, Daesh, etc., has been neutralized. Now we're having talks between Syrian opposition and the government. There's some disagreement still, but they're moving closer towards an understanding. They've managed to separate out the so-called moderate rebels who, and that's arguable, but from obviously the extreme fringes of Daesh, etc., who want to just, well, they're not interested in just overthrowing Assad. They just want to take over the country in totality. But of course, now it's starting to come to light that there's organizations who've admitted funding so-called militants in Syria, and there's legal cases going on. Well, how long is it going to be before we see such an organization being linked to Daesh or, the Islamic State or whoever else? That's highly likely on the card. But it's been a huge wake-up call, and this is why it's interesting that Netanyahu's going off to see Putin this week.
Yeah.
He's now suddenly very fearful, but what's he going to do? He's going to go to Putin and claim that Iran's the big bad enemy in the Middle East. Well, Iran seems to have done a lot to curb the problems in Syria. There's this idea that Iran's trying to curry favor and take over Iraq. Well, that's nonsense. There's a natural affinity between the nations, despite the West doing everything to keep the nations apart. Yeah. And the problem is, what's Netanyahu going to do? Because the fact is, Putin will say, I'm sorry, we back Assad. We always have. We're not going to back away. Iran's not doing anything wrong. So what is your point? Right. And what we're seeing increasingly is nation after nation in the Middle East that is not willing to form an alliance with Netanyahu is doing quite the opposite. So Netanyahu is very much isolated. And at some point, he's going to have to turn around and say, okay, well, what am I going to do? Keep suggesting this is a problem? Because I think increasingly, we'll see what happens, but I haven't heard a lot come out of the Trump administration with regards to Iran lately. Very little said. But I think the desperation for Netanyahu to go and see Putin is he feels very threatened. Now, okay, why does he feel threatened? Is Iran really the problem? No. I think Israel does have problems. We know that there's a lot of discontent within his own nation towards Netanyahu and his government. And I think he's feeling the heat, and he's trying to deflect that heat away and find someone else to blame for the problems in the Middle East. But I don't think he'll get any change out of Putin. So what does he do then? He's being backed more and more into a corner.
Right.
And he's got no way of dealing with it. And of course, the world's looking at what's going on in the Middle East, and Russia is the peacemaker. They are also taking the fight to whoever it is, be it Daesh or whatever, but they're also the peacemaker, and they're resolving a lot of problems in the Middle East. And every week, we're seeing more and more reinforcement of that. Yep. And more and more nations are now trusting them. Yep. People trust Russia and go, yeah, we're happy for example, the Saudis go, well, yeah, we have major issues with our sworn enemy Iran, but we want an end to it. And they see Russia as as the kind of glue between the nations that can resolve the problems. And
Absolutely.
this is exactly what the cabal don't want. They don't want to see all these nations now talking and cooperating with each other, because for decades they kept them all at each other's throats. Because, of course, it's the old cliche: united we stand, divided we fall. And by God, they have not tried to divide the world in every way possible, simply
Sure.
on that basis that that is the way they control. Well, that controlling influence is falling in the European Union. It's collapsing in the Middle East, it's collapsing in the US, and that's why they're getting more and more desperate and coming out with these absolutely ridiculous comments um, with regards to Russia and Trump. But of course, what's interesting is coming out in the UK is the whole Russian question is starting to really rear its head. Now, by all accounts, I think there's a realization that the kind of idea that RT and all those were producing fake news, there's no substance to this. So the UK Parliament's backing away from that. There's also the idea that it's about time we grew up and started having relations with Russia. Apparently, the government's very split, but increasingly that split's narrowing, and people are realizing, well, it's about time we did grow up and started to have constructive dialogue. We need to work together in countering terrorism, improve bilateral relations,
Yeah.
and initiate discussions on subjects they haven't talked about for years. So what happens? Boris Johnson's off to Moscow for high-level talks. And of course, the UK is playing down, going, it doesn't mean there's a return to business as usual. But the desperation to go there is because they realise we're going to have to start working with Russia, and we need to work with them in the fight against global terrorism, not just in Syria and Iraq, because the risk is now in this new world. These terrorist acts, which a lot of them, yes, there were false flags and terrorist attacks were happening, which were instigated by the cabal. That's no longer the case. All nations have a risk of this global terrorism, and I've mentioned it many times, but it is going to be the problem going forward in the future, as well as cyber terrorism, which is a massive problem that is slowly beginning to dawn on every nation. You know, this is a huge risk. Someone can come in the back door and cause economic terrorism to a nation, which is, and we know as well as anybody else, they could have huge, serious implications for a nation if that happens.
Yeah.
Imagine somebody coming in the back door and getting access to a nation's financial systems and wreaking havoc in the process. I mean, anything's possible, and I'm not being alarmist. That's the reality. I mean, to kind of put some context on this, NATO are now starting to admit they're subject to hundreds of cyber attacks on a monthly basis. The Russians have admitted that they've suddenly had this exponential increase in cyber attacks that have happened in their nation in 2016 as opposed to any other year, and it goes on and on. The UK have admitted similar problems, and this is why it's a massive problem that needs to be addressed. And even in the UK, they're starting to realise that the amount of so-called ransomware associated just with people having Android phones, which how many people? Okay, yeah, a lot of people have iPhones, but across the world, there's so many people with Android phones. This is a
Yeah.
massive problem, and that's increased by probably 50% in 2016.
Yeah.
Nations are realizing this is a massive problem. So all of a sudden, traditional enemies are going, hang on, we all have these problems. Oh, the real problems going forward are are global, not universal, and we all have to deal with them. So they're going to have to start working with nations. And I think the problem in the UK is that there's an establishment who actually still think that they're controlling their empire, and they're sat on their horse surveying their land and their fiefdom or serfdom without actually realizing that the horse under them is dead,
Hmm.
and they're flat on their backs. They just haven't woken up to the reality of it yet. But within
Yeah.
government circles in the UK, certain elements of it are now waking up, going, we're in big trouble and we're going to have to change our policy. So we're going to have to just grow up and stop behaving this way, because ultimately it's deeply damaging to us as a nation if we carry on pursuing this idea. Because, yeah, if they turn their backs on Russia and China and nations like that, economically and militarily, they're going to have huge problems, because Russia does have great advanced tech. And if we're some way off that, but at some point nations start to trust each other, they can work for common goals and eradicate major problems. But the whole point with terrorism is we still don't hear it.
Hmm.
When's someone going to say to every nation on the planet, who the hell's financing these people, training them and arming them? And if
Right.
we deal with that problem, that will cut a huge amount of the problems literally overnight. And that's something that nations are really uncomfortable at this point talking to other nations because the UK doesn't particularly want to hear what Russia's got to say, because they're very uncomfortable with the answers they're going to get. And it's the same probably with the US talking to Russia or anyone else, because I think the reality is Trump knew there was a problem. I don't think even he realized just how big a problem he's got within his own nation in terms of all the various arms of his administration and what they're involved in, particularly intelligence. Yeah, I think he's actually been quite surprised, and also surprised to some extent at the level of insanity that has existed within previous administrations and what they've done. Because I mean, you and I can say, and anyone listening, well, we're aware of the insanity of what's going on. But for someone like that, in the position he was in, I don't think he appreciated the full extent of it. But now he really is. And therefore, when people say, well, I'm a bit fearful that Trump, is not aware of what's going on in moves to overthrow him, what's happening in the intelligence services, what's really going on in terms of US foreign policy, he's fully aware of it now. And the truth is, even if they found a way, and I don't think they will, that they could overthrow Trump, it doesn't matter, because there is a process in place now that no one can stop. And if they try to remove him and think they can get rid of him, it's too far gone down the track. It will carry on, and the cabal are finished, dead and buried. It might take another year. It could take 6 months. It could take 2 years. But every day they're getting weaker and weaker, and that's why they're lashing out. And you're hearing some of the apologists coming out with, as you said earlier, the most insane comment that even the average person's now turning around going, this is absolute rubbish. I'm not even buying this anymore. And the whole anti-Russian rhetoric is beginning to die. And certainly it's dying in the UK because the media is not reporting it the same way. And I've heard people say to me that surprised me, because for years they went, oh, you're just a Russiophobe. No, they're the Russophobes. I'm Russophilic and I love Russia. And they're now saying to me, do you know what? We're actually starting to see it is rubbish, because the level and the intensity of it just doesn't match reality. So, and once again, it's another example of how they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Absolutely, man. I totally agree 100%. They are shooting themselves in the foot. They are at this point such a time of desperation for them. The narrative has changed. The paradigm is not even the same paradigm. The levers of control, on the various mechanisms that they utilize in order to propagate their perception upon the rest of us, to form our to cause us to causing having them form our opinions for us, and this whole control system that they've been running for decades, Paul, it's over with. So I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, it's the people see it, and I think this groundswell of nationalism is not going to be stopped. I think you're right. It's only going to continue. It is the natural course of things these days.
Yeah, and of course, and this is why we're seeing, nation after nation across the world now going, we've had enough of this whatever adjective you want to use, as strong as it might be. We're just sick to death of it, and we want to change. And they're just voting for other parties that they feel will provide that change. And so, therefore, Brexit was not a vote in terms of the British government, but it was a vote to say we've had enough of the European Union. And nation after nation initially in the European Union is going, oh, this is ridiculous. And now nation after nation is going, do you know what? This is a great idea. We're sick to death of it. We want an end to it. Well, who are we going to vote for to get rid of this? We want an end to the establishment, and the so-called populist parties are going to get elected. Now that may cause its own set of problems going forward in the future, and we'll have to see what happens with regard to that. But there's just a realization that enough's enough, and something we were going to touch on. I think it's quite interesting that the travel ban's been reissued, an executive order that's been signed and takes effect in 10 days. Now, of the original 7 countries, Iraq is no longer part of the ban. Why? Because Iraq's demonstrated that based on their enhanced screening and reporting measures, they meet the criteria. That means the US is no longer concerned about Iraqi citizens coming into the US. The order also will allow to do with Syrian refugees. They'll face the same 120-day ban as refugees from other countries, so they're being actually consistent in terms of what they're dealing with. They've also said that that if you have travel documents, if you have a visa, if you're a legal permanent resident, you're not covered under this new executive order. And the whole basis is that these are the countries like Yemen, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and Somalia. They're going to put this order in for 3 months, while the government, i.e. the US, determines whether people from these countries can be sufficiently vetted for supposed terrorist sympathies. Now, this isn't about the concerns about from the US. The US is saying we're concerned that these nations don't vet people. They allow these people to leave. By the time they get here, we can't necessarily vet them efficiently. We want to make sure in future that legitimate people from these nations are allowed into the US without any difficulties. We have an immigration system that works efficiently and allows people in. And those people who shouldn't be coming into the country aren't allowed in. Now, if that's the reality of it, where's the problem? People can foam at the mouth about this. That is sensible policy, and it all relates to the fact that Trump knows there's global terrorism is a big problem, and he wants to prevent people entering the US that may, at some point in the future, cause a major incident in a US town, city, or wherever else. That makes complete sense. But of course, the narrative gets switched that it's all demonizing Muslims in countries. Now people will say, well, okay, why is he not imposing this on every other nation?
Right.
Well, the question is, well, where do they think the major problems come from? And why did, if they have an issue with it, why did Obama list these countries originally himself, which people seem to have forgotten? So, I mean, the argument is that there has to be some sort of executive order put in place until nations are satisfied that people coming from countries are valid people. And once that's sorted out, that's why Iraq's no longer part of the ban, because they've demonstrated to the US we're taking the necessary steps to avoid these problems. And if other nations do likewise, they'll be removed. And it's not a permanent ban. It's 3 months. And in 3 months, that will give these nations sufficient time to demonstrate they're handling the global problem of international terrorism, which isn't going to go away. And that's the other thing. People think you remove the cabal, it ends. It's not going to end. It's going to take a long time to remove this. And this also comes in where the US is going to slash a lot of its foreign aid, and it's going to divert those funds into the US military budget. Now, if there's a global, and we said this before, but it's worth reiterating it, if there's a global threat of terrorism, then the US military needs to make sure it has the most up-to-date equipment so it can deal with these problems, traditionally okay on an international stage, but also in terms of internally, if there are, let's hope it isn't the case, but there are any problems in the future within the US, so, or any other nation for that matter across the globe that has internal terrorist problems, which Europe's been beset with for quite a few years, as everybody knows. These are important distinctions. So when people say, well, how is he going to finance it? He's going to spend more money. And I can't remember who it was who was saying, well, the US is just spending 54 billion more, without actually saying, well, hang on, what are they doing elsewhere to cut costs? And if they slash their foreign military expenditure, where they wasted trillions of dollars whatsoever, when they stop spending that money can be diverted into, be it the US military or infrastructure projects within the US or anywhere else. It's about balancing your budget. So the idea we look in isolation of things isn't the answer. So, and people are going, oh, well, it's the US military. They're just flexing their arms. They want to go and conquer nations. Well, if they believe that, with regards to Syria, and what I've understood, is the US will assist. It wants to remove the problem with regards to the Daesh, etc., in the Middle East. And there is a Pentagon plan that's under review. But their attitude is, with regards to Syria, is we'll take a bit of a back seat. We don't really want to be on the front line. We'll assist where we can, but we'll leave it to Russia to do the donkey work, so to speak. That is a far cry from previous US administrations, that it wants to be part.
Absolutely.
And also we're now seeing that the US is actually working with Russia, because there's this whole issue, where of the city of Manbij, which now the US is working with Russia to defend the city, because there's concerns that the Turkish military are trying to take control because of the Kurdish influence there. And the Russians and the Americans are sitting back going, we're not going to allow Turkey to do this and turn this problem into something far worse. So they are working together, and the US is taking a different stance and a different approach to how it deals with international issues, which is something very different from a previous administration. But the idea that the US just stops spending money on in terms of military is just a nonsense. It can't happen at this stage. We're a far cry in this world from not needing a military presence in nations and also military cooperation globally to solve massive ongoing problems that incidentally were of course caused by the cabal, and you don't remove the cabal and the problems disappear overnight. And a lot of people were conditioned into believing that, oh well, get rid of the cabal and 2 weeks later the world's a great place and we're all going to be happy and no more problems. And it's going to take years to resolve because it's the old billion pieces of string all intertwined, and we have to unravel them one by one to understand what the problems are. And that's the same way of dealing with the whole matter of how do we arrest people and try them according to due process in the US or any other nation. We have to unravel all these pieces of string and understand that whilst it's great to have a high profile person, there's someone far bigger behind them pulling their strings. And we need to get to the bottom of unraveling every piece of string to understand who's responsible. And ultimately, there's going to be people who will be adjudicated who no one's ever heard of, who are far more sinister than anybody we're aware of. That is an absolute certainty. And we need to get those people. Because once it's like the seven-headed hydra. What you do, just keep chopping away at each head, hoping you'll kill it. No, find the stem, chop the stem off. All seven heads die simultaneously.
Right. Absolutely. Very well said. Um, and that's when, the world gets, it's revealed to the world, individuals like Soros and Carlos Slim and whatnot, that's going to be uncovered, as well as all other nefarious world actors, from around the world.
Yeah, absolutely, but it's going to take time. And
Yeah.
yes, no nation's immune to these problems, but the difference with Russia and China is they've got removed corruption on a massive scale from their country, and they still acknowledge the fact there are massive problems that need addressing. But they're in the process of doing that. The Western nations, the US, UK, Europe, etc., is still dealing with the reality of that, and there's a lot of uncomfortable decisions that are going to have to be made in the future. But I think the one advantage the US have is that Trump will do this, and yes, he's going to take a lot of stick, flack, and people won't agree with him. But the bottom line is judge him in a year or two's time, see what progress he's made. If he's done nothing, fair enough. You have every reason to say, well, that was why didn't we bother voting for him? But give the guy a chance to do things and see what he actually does, not what people in the mainstream media, and for that matter in the alternative media, because they're equally guilty of writing
Sure.
sensationalistic rubbish but albeit on the flip side, and making kind of statement. I've seen all sorts of statements about Trump's written this executive order, which means he's going to tackle all these problems, and there's no such executive order in existence. So
Right.
people need to do the research. When you read stuff, go and look for something to substantiate it, or just assess the viability or the reality of what's been said, because equally there's an awful lot of rubbish put out there. And at the end of the day, even if it's boring, tedious, dull, disinteresting, the truth is what needs to prevail. And that's why doing the shows like this and what Rogue Money's trying to do and what I'm trying to do and other people are trying to do is expose the truth. It's not always exciting. It's not always glamorous. It can seem quite dry at times, but there's a big picture unfolding, and that's all we're trying to do is put the pieces together to give people an understanding of what's going on. And that's what Rogue Money and all the guests do equally very
Absolutely.
well. And that's the whole point of what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And with that in truth and information, why don't you plug your website, Paul, as well as your premium services that you offer that we are huge, huge fans of.
Well, first off, thanks for that. And it is true what V says. They don't get a penny out of it. They just really want to help us out. And for that, we're eternally grateful. But yeah, the website's thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. And yes, we have a lot of free articles on there. There's over 100. We try to write one a week or so now, time permitting. But yes, we have the premium content, which you go is on the homepage. You get 5 podcasts a week, typically 10 to 15 minutes each. But we feel the amount of information you get in 10 to 15 minutes is probably like an hour, because everybody comes back to us and says we need to listen to it 2 or 3 times because it's that much density of information. And that's $4.75 a month, which you get 22 podcasts roughly. Obviously, we've got the Twitter page at thesiriusreport.com. We've got the YouTube channel, which we're going to start to utilize more, which is obviously London Paul. And we've got the Facebook page for, the Sirius Report, and obviously the premium content Facebook page, which is a little bit underutilized, but time is of the essence, and we have to kind of cut our time accordingly. And I guess in essence, that's basically what we do. But a big thank you to everyone at Rogue Money for all their support. We greatly appreciate it, and it's a real pleasure for us for me to come on and do the show each week with V.
Absolutely. And we love having you on. And again, guys, it's you want to know, in order for you to understand what's really going on in the United States, you have to understand what's going on in the world. Because there's a move that is occurring right now that we are no longer the central focus point of this nexus. There is a new paradigm emerging, and in order for you to really get and really understand where our place is in this world, of where we will be at this new table of trade and e-commerce that is emerging in the world, where would our seat be at this table? You need real intel. You need real information, not jokers who are great on some domestic issues, but they are so far off on understanding the game overseas. This is why it's imperative you subscribe to Paul's broadcast, his subscription, his premium broadcast, because that is pretty much like a presidential briefing every day, 10 to 15 minutes. You'll get the entire breakdown of what's important and how the real events and the real players and the real money is shaping the entire world. With that being said, guys, check out his website again, thesiriusreport.com. You can follow him on Twitter at the Sirius Report, and also you can follow us at the Rogue Money on Twitter, and as well as the roguemoney.net website. With that being said, guys, it's our honor to have Paul, and we can't wait to have him back on next Monday. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more things to talk about. With that being said, we are over and out. Thank you all for listening in. Have a great day. Bye-bye.